Welcome and greetings from Jerusalem. I'm Jonathan Hudson, and this is Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute. And in today's edition, we're going to focus on Jerusalem's foreign policy. What does that actually mean? What are the implications? Where is the U.S.-Israel relationship currently at? And what are the regional foreign policy considerations from Jerusalem's perspective? All that and more. Let's turn to introduce all of our distinguished guests for today. From left to right, we'll start with Dr. Yonatan Shechter, who is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, who formerly served as Jerusalem's chief foreign policy advisor, the Prime Minister's office, of course. Next to him is Dr. Uzi Arad, who formerly served as Jerusalem's foreign policy advisor or chief foreign policy advisor, as well as national security advisor and the director of the National Security Council. And if we go a couple of decades earlier, of course, you were also a research fellow under Herman Kahn at Hudson Institute. So it's a pleasure also to mention that. And next to you, last but not least, is Ambassador Dani Ayalon, who formerly served also as Jerusalem's chief foreign policy advisor of the Prime Minister's office, an Israeli ambassador to the United States, and of course, a deputy foreign minister here in Jerusalem. It's a pleasure to have all of you here together on the show to discuss Jerusalem's foreign policy. And to start with you, Dr. Shechter, may I identify the Israel-U.S. relationship as the most important pillar within Jerusalem's foreign policy these days?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, thank you for having me. It's good to be here and to be with my esteemed colleagues. I would agree with that. I think that the United States is obviously Israel's strategic ally, which has no parallel among any of Israel's allies and partners around the world. I think that in many ways, Israel's strength and Israel's success is tied to that of the United States. I think that when the United States is perceived to be strong and successful, that's good for Israel. When the United States is perceived to be weaker or struggling, I think that is bad for Israel. And I think that we've seen this manifest itself in recent years, especially with the ups and downs that both countries have experienced.
Absolutely. Dr. Arad, how would you characterize it from your perspective?
Well, it is true that there is a strong connection between what transpires in the United States and the role that the United States is playing and what Israel has to do and is doing, and that the value of this relationship between Israel and America is immensely important to Israel, at least, and there is much to be done there. But at the same time, it is also interesting that the United States is undergoing a period in which it is crafting its own way in a changing world and is taking some departures from past policies as it is steering its own role. And we have to follow suit on one account because we are allies of the United States, and it is clear that it is in that camp that we belong. And at the same time, we have our own difficulties here in Israel, and the task is very difficult to steer our own policy at this time. So it's an enormously complicated undertaking, which I hope would result in a well-coordinated policy of joint action and coordinated action between Israel and America.
Absolutely. Ambassador Ayalon?
If I may take, Jonathan, a very short historic perspective, I would say it was a constant in Zionist and, of course, the State of Israel foreign policy that a fundamental principle or tenet was that to rely on a major power. With Theodor Herzl, of course, was the trying with the Austro-Hungarian and then the Ottoman Empire and the Great Britain with the State of Israel reestablished in 1948 was even the who would think that the Soviet Union, then France, and then since 1967 until now is the United States of America. And with the US, one of the golden rules was not to show, not even to have, but if we do have, not to show a daylight between Israel and the United States, and actually project the might of the United States through this alliance of Israel and the US. So I would say that if Israel has two major bases, one it's or maybe even three, military power, economic or technological power, and the relations with the United States and the backing of the United States. There was a period of time a few years ago that there was thinking here among some, even in the government of Netanyahu, to actually diversify the Israeli, let's say, thinking relations with the United States to other countries, whether it was Russia or China. Was thinking that maybe China will be the next real power, maybe to also limit or minimize our dependence on the United States. But I think after the 7th of October, nobody's thinking about that. Certainly not after the re-election of President Trump. And I believe together we will continue to work for the interest of both countries, which are very much intertwined.
I think the term would be hedging to a certain degree in a very challenging international landscape, particularly with the rise of China over the course of several years. Of course, Israel has established relations during the time when Dr. Schechter was in government as the chief foreign policy advisor, the relations with China. But nonetheless, all the people who've engaged with China have always been explicitly clear that it doesn't come at the expense of the United States, which is regarded as the strategic backbone of the state of Israel when we're talking about geopolitics and beyond that.
Yes, I think that's right. I think there was an effort to broaden, to expand, and diversify Israel's foreign relations, but that wasn't at the expense of its relationship with the United States, because the United States really has no substitute. I should say, going to the history that Donnie mentioned, there's an interesting back and forth in terms of American power and Israeli power. That is, the United States was the first country to recognize Israel's independence, going back to 1948, but you didn't have the kind of close relationship and partnership that you see today until much later, and especially, as Donnie mentioned, after the Six-Day War in 1967. And of course, Michael Oren has talked quite a bit about, at the beginning of that war, Israel was warned by the United States that, if it were to start this war alone, it would be alone. After the outcome of the war was clear and Israel was seen not just as the victor, but as a regional power, that's really when you start to see the relationship go in the direction that we're more familiar with today. That is, Israel benefits from America's strength and perceived power, and I think the United States benefits from Israel's strength and perceived power. And these things they're certainly not equal by any stretch, but they are in many ways, I think, mutually beneficial. And I think during the period that you just mentioned, there were opportunities that we saw to enhance Israel's relationships. And we saw that in places like Latin America and in Africa and in Asia. When during the period that I was there, we were in India, we were in Africa, I think 3 times in a year and a half, after an Israeli prime minister hadn't been in Africa in 20 years. We did a trip through South America, and the relationships with Russia and China, I think, were very practical. And the relationship with Russia in particular really became more important after the Russian involvement stepped up in Syria in 2015. That's when you start to see these more frequent calls and visits with Putin, and it raised, to be frank, it raised some eyebrows in Washington, where we would meet with congressional delegations, and they would say, this is Russia, these are the bad guys, what are you doing? And we would sit down and we could explain, well, the Russian Air Force is operating in the same airspace as the Israeli Air Force, and we don't want to crash into each other, and we don't want to attack each other. And so they created this deconfliction mechanism, which was seen as very practical and actually proved to be quite successful. It didn't mean that Russia was an ally. It didn't mean that it was a substitute by any stretch for the United States, but it had very specific, very practical purposes that in many ways seems to have now been, as they say in Washington, overcome by events.
Indeed. Well, naturally, the deconfliction mechanism was brought forth or spearheaded by the prime minister. His dignitary to push that forward was at the time the deputy commander or chief of general staff of the IDF, Major General in Reserve Yair Golan, and this fluctuating relationship between Moscow and Jerusalem was not always very joyful, to say the least, but it had its practical silver lining, so to speak, including the return of certain hostages that, by the way, then crossed into Syrian territory, either by mistake or for other reasons, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, there were a couple of humanitarian cases that the Russians were instrumental in. But when we're talking about the current state of play, Russia is seemingly in decline in Syria. They've lost practically the Latakia Air Force Base, and Taltus is also pretty much a goner for them. And therefore, Dr. Arad, when we're looking right now about this new situation in Syria, can we expect also Russian-Israeli relations to somehow become less of a focal point in Israel's calculus?
I don't think that we could ignore Russian presence and Russian attempts to stay, even to retain their bases in Syria. They do have an interest in being here in the Middle East. They do have an interest in being in the Mediterranean, and we should recognize that. But again, we have to engage with the Russians, and engagement does not mean cooperation necessarily, but it is better than not being engaged, because you have to coordinate certain things, and we will do so. But clearly, all this positioning, our positioning in the region and in its vicinity, will be done in the context of what is now being also the game of influence and competition in influence over the Middle East by the external powers. Russia is still trying to have some influence here, and it does. America, we would like to see have even greater influence in the Middle East and greater involvement with its local and regional allies. China is present, and to some extent, it is a confrontation matter that we have to also deal with. But what would govern the day would be that one would have relations, on certain points, even cooperation. Remember that at times, Russia was a member or a visitor, observer of NATO, then it was kicked out. But then NATO now has an interest in actually confronting Russia. But at all that time, diplomatic contacts or professional contacts have been maintained. One does not necessarily boycott anybody, and I think we would have to consider and be in contact with Russia. And to some extent, we may have also interest that we need to attend to when it comes to Russia. First and foremost, for example, is the extent to which Russia may be supportive of the Iranian aggressive measures in the Middle East. We would like to see some Russian distancing from that support. And if only for that, there is some justification to an engagement policy with Russia.
Indeed. Ambassador Ayalon, let's talk briefly about China. China is very eager to further promote its Road and Belt Initiative throughout the Middle East, alongside, of course, also its Sea and Port Initiative. It's been quite successful for many years, but it seems like in recent years, much of the bets that it put down and the significant investments at that, from $400 billion over the course of 25 years to the Islamic Republic of Iran, all the way to its involvement in the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement that seems now in question in light of the latest developments in Yemen, where the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah, which is dominated, of course, by the Houthi tribe, is fueling some belligerence once more to the Saudi-backed government in Yemen. Are we going to see a certain uptick in geostrategic competition when we're talking about this region between the United States on the one hand, China on the other, and of course, Israel is regarded in the camp of Washington in this context?
Yes, Jonathan. I think, unfortunately, it is almost inevitable that we will see a deepening of the conflict between the US and China for many reasons. There is both countries look at their competition on world's influence and world's theater as a almost a zero-sum game. We just hope that this will not come out to a conflagration and will keep the competition on the technological, on maybe economic spheres only. But we see that China is actually almost taking over from Russia in terms of its global reach. Russia, for obvious reasons, is very much engaged now in its own plight in the Ukraine, economically under sanctions and all that. And we see that China is really trying to spread its wings all over the Road and Belt, as you mentioned, trying to get alliances, I would say, concurrently with the United States. So they are approaching countries like Saudi Arabia, which has always been in the on the side or the camp of the United States, but they're trying to actually, tempt them with arms and of course their purchasing power. Iran, it's of course it's a no-brainer, but also Egypt or even Jordan. So I think we, Israel, as Dr. Arad mentioned, we cannot ignore Russia and its interest, and we cannot ignore China and its interest, although we have, I would say in the past, even recent past, we almost compromised our relationship with China because of our alliance with the United States. There was a case, I'm sure all of us here remember, of the Falcon, which was an intelligence, I'd say electronic warfare, reconnaissance plane that Israel was providing with to China, and we had to actually null and avoid and cancel this this thing. And China realized then that we are basically very much dependent on the US, and I think this was kind of a pivotal moment where, yes, they do need Israeli technology, but they understand that they cannot and will not get technology in the military sphere or intelligence, but maybe agriculture or things like that. But this is not strong enough for them to actually be nice to Israel on the expense of Iran and the other countries. So I think that if we look into the future, as mentioned here, there's no substitute, of course, to the United States and our alliance, but not only because there is great compatibility between Israel and the United States, but also because a great incompatibility between Israel and, let's say, China, for that matter.
Thank you, Ambassador Ayalon. This, of course, brings to mind also the current American approach when we're talking about the negotiations between the United States and Russia to the root cause that is, of course, articulated now, or at least rationalized by the leadership in Washington with regard to this move. And it goes down to the strategy of Henry Kissinger, who said that when you confront two major adversaries in strategic power competition, always go after the weaker one, pacify it in order to contend later with a stronger one in the two, something that we need, of course, also to take into context. Now, let's turn to you, Dr. Schechter. If we focus now on a regional perspective, I'd like you to provide us Jerusalem's foreign policy to our northern front. What can you tell us about that?
I think I'd like to also just point out the other thing attributed to Kissinger, which is that Israel doesn't have a foreign policy. It only has a domestic policy, which I think is also no less true for the United States right now. So that's something also that we have to keep in mind as we see everything that's going on. In the North, I think it's largely an open question in the sense that, as you pointed out, you mentioned that the Russians hold on their assets in Tartus and in Latakia are weaker than they were, but the other asset that they've lost definitively in Syria is the president, is Assad. And I think there's still an open question about the kind of regime that the new Syrian regime is going to be. I heard the other day that he's already the new president has already been invited to the Elysee in Paris, which to me seems sort of backwards in the sense that I think the burden of proof on what kind of regime this is going to be and what's going to happen in Syria needs to be on that regime, and that these things need to be demonstrated first. Israel has made it clear that it's going to stay. Its forces are going to stay where they are, and they seem to be setting certain red lines about the presence of HTS and of threats to the Druze communities in southern Syria. So I think all eyes are going to be right now on domestically what happens in Syria and what that means for relations with Russia, with Iran, with Lebanon. And then how that projects further out, including on Israel, I should say, especially on Israel.
It's outrageous, the fact that France is spearheading this. Of course, they won the extension of their contract for the Latakia terminals in the port there with the French multinational corporations dealing with a container or operating that container depot, and that is frustrating to see. The European Union has also lifted sanctions on a couple of airlines and banks related to the interim Damascus regime, which is, quite frankly, it's Al-Qaeda. You look at the people pulling the strings, it's Al-Qaeda, the same people who stood behind the atrocities committed on 9/11. But we don't have time to discuss all of that. Dr. Arad, from an Eastern perspective, if you could do that really in a minute and 10 seconds, please.
Well, clearly that remains in some ways the central question to this moment, because it is clear that the destabilizing activities in the Middle East are all managed from Iran. Even when we talk about Hezbollah, devoid of Iranian support, is inoperative. So it is Iran that we should contain and, in fact, control and act against. And the problem with Iran is that it is still capable of inflicting damage to Middle East stability, but also because of the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is still on the agenda in the sense that Iran still has a program, and now efforts are underway to contain that progress through a possible agreement. Maybe such an agreement may be being discussed, but if it is discussed and if it has to have any value, it has to be an agreement that takes back. It's a rollback agreement that would distance Iran from the threshold of nuclear operational capability. And that should be at the center of our activities and also at the center of the policies that will be pursued by the American administration and even its European allies, which remain European allies of the United States, which also has a policy on preventing Iran from becoming operationally nuclear.
Absolutely. Ambassador Ayalon, in 1 minute, 55 seconds, focusing on the southern arena, going from Yemen all the way also to Egypt.
Right. Well, we have enjoyed 45 years of stability on our southern front with the peace agreement that we have with Egypt, which was very important. And now there are some, I would say, some stringent moves on that front. Again, maybe all following of the 7th of October, but even before that. And it is very important, of course, for Israel, for Egypt as well, to keep this peace going, albeit cold peace, but it's important for both countries. It's important for the stability of the region. And I believe the United States, again, we go back to the US, will do everything in order to keep our two countries, Egypt and Israel, on the same page. But I would say, given all this instability, it is very important for Israel to keep its own qualitative military edge. I think this is something which has proven itself to be the best, let's say, insurance policy for the continuation and for the prosperity and for the well-being of the Jewish state.
So with that, I'd like to immediately thank Ambassador Ayalon, Dr. Arad and Dr. Schechter for all of your insights, and also to thank all of you at home as well. This has been Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, wishing you a good day. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.